Mackenzie Johnston with Tri-State Livestock News, bringing you discussions concerning fair cattle markets. Today we have the opportunity to chat with Jodie Anderson. She is the Executive Director of the South Dakota Cattlemen's Association. Jodie, will you just tell me a little bit about yourself, your name, your involvement within the cattle industry, and your role with South Dakota Cattlemen's Association?
Sure. So my name is Jodie Anderson. I'm the Executive Director for the South Dakota Cattlemen's Association. I've served in that role for a little more than 15 years now. Our office is in Pierre, and I consider Pierre my hometown. My family ranches northwest of Pierre, about 65 miles in Hawken County. I'm a fourth generation beef producer, but a first generation South Dakotan. So my family expanded their farming and ranching enterprises in the 50s and 60s from Texas into South Dakota. So my sister and I are the first generation of actual born and bred South Dakotans. So that's kind of exciting, kind of fun. We still have a Texas connection, of course, and family in Texas as well. But I've been, like I said, Pierre's kind of my hometown, and I've been back here since I took this role with the South Dakota Cattlemen's Association.
So what do you feel are the major issues standing in the way of fair cattle markets?
I really think, Mackenzie, the biggest challenge we have right now is defining what's fair. And fair for whom, right? Because there are multiple segments in the supply chain. And what's fair for me as a cow-calf producer may not seem fair to the feeder. And what's fair for the feeder may not seem fair to the people on both sides of the feeder. And so I think we really have to figure out what does fair mean? And because if we don't really identify that, I think it's really hard to know if we've achieved that goal. You know, realistically, we're all ultimately in the business of serving the beef consumer. And so ultimately they have to have a role in deciding that as well, because, you know, whatever we do in the supply chain affects what, number one, you know, the product that we're serving up to our consumers, and also at what price point. And so just trying to define fair for me is the hard part at this point, really.
Do you think how do we go about defining fair? What solutions do you think can be put into place in order to reach fairness for as many sectors of the segment, as many sectors of the industry as possible?
I wish I knew the answer to that, because frankly, if I did, I think I would not be working for the South Dakota Cattlemen's Association anymore. I mean, realistically, I don't know how we achieve that. We have fought for years, decades, generations to not become the vertically integrated enterprises that, you know, other protein sectors have experienced. And so without going down that road, it's really hard to achieve similar partnerships, maybe, if you will. And as we're all trying to work independently and yet together to produce a product for the end consumer, it becomes difficult to gather everyone together and to really accomplish what we think is fair for everybody, or for even the most sectors in the economy. So I wish I knew the answer to that. You know, I think we just really have to keep the lines of communication open. We have to be as open and transparent with our supply chain partners as we can be. And we have to be really cognizant. You know, I fall into the cow-calf sector. I know lots of cow-calf producers also retain ownership and maybe fall into the cow-calf and the feeding sector to some extent. But we have to be really I think, open and transparent, and make sure that we keep talking about how we conduct ourselves in a business-like manner that produces a safe product and continue to build beef demand, because ultimately, if there's not beef demand, then none of us are in business anymore. And so we need to make sure we don't do anything to threaten that along the way as well. And that's a challenge I think we sometimes fall short of in our industry, more so than I wish we did as producers.
Right.
We lose sight of the fact that not everybody loves our product maybe as much as we do.
Right, definitely. So you mentioned market transparency. Do you feel like our cattle markets need more transparency within them?
I think there's always opportunity to be more transparent. You know, we in South Dakota I know there's a lot of talk, and I think we're going to get to that a little bit later, maybe the 50% mandate for cash trade. I think our organization and our industry, I feel, should resist mandates. We've been resistant to government mandates on a number of levels and a number of areas in the past. My concern is that when we start talking about mandates and we don't fully vet what the potential repercussions of that mandate is, but we're struggling. I don't want to not acknowledge that the markets are definitely struggling. But I just, sort of my personal mantra has become no permanent solutions in the middle of a crisis, because I think we have a tendency to maybe not fully think those potential solutions through as thoroughly as we would if we weren't in the middle of a crisis. And I think that transparency is great. We have the opportunity with the upcoming renewal of livestock mandatory reporting, which expires the end of September, to make some changes through that already existing mechanism to increase transparency. And I think that seems like the appropriate vehicle to do that in, versus, a mandate we may not fully understand how that adds cost and potential value moving forward.
So you mentioned the 5014 bill that has been brought forward by Senator Chuck Grassley, and from what you said, I gather that you're not fully behind it because it's essentially a mandate. So if that's the case, how do you feel we do bring competition back into our cattle markets?
I think that's a little bit of the million-dollar question, right?
Yes, it is.
We know there is a very small number of packers who, produce the vast majority of, they're the gateway, if you will, between us as producers and beef consumers, and we need them. We need to have them be viable entities. We've learned through this pandemic that while we plan for lots of really highly communicable animal diseases, we kind of failed to plan in our industry for a human disease that would impact that gateway. And so I think there's a lot we can learn from that moving forward as well. But I think, we just really need to continue to make that sector of the industry, help them remain viable. And we recognize, we're in a cyclical industry, right? There's sometimes when the cow-calf guys are making money. There's sometimes when the feeders are making money. There's sometimes when the packers are making money. And those things tend to not be all at the same time, generally speaking, unfortunately. We would love to see our organization supports. We have a very robust state meat inspection program in South Dakota. We would love to be able to see state inspected product be sold across state lines, which is a really pretty high hurdle. It's not impossible, but it's a really high hurdle right now, especially for more of the local locker plant type facilities. Without a really big major packing plant in the state, that doesn't make a huge difference, but it could make some difference to some of those folks that are interested in doing more direct marketing of their product and whatnot. So we'd like to see that as one potential solution, make that hurdle maybe a little lower. I don't want it to go away entirely. We definitely want beef that's being sold to consumers to be inspected. But we definitely also would love to be able to broaden those markets for people that choose to participate in that way. I think one of our representatives from South Dakota has talked about, do we need a feasibility study to explore the economics of those more small and mid-sized packing plants? And perhaps we do. We do have one of those in South Dakota that's operating today. They've had some of the same challenges as the major packers in terms of illness, COVID-19 related worker shortages. And so, we really need to figure out, I think, how to address the people aspect of the packing industry, apparently, too, in addition to, the animal aspect. And I think, if we, again, as I mentioned, if we can figure out our organization would like to see some ideas and proposals, and we're struggling a little bit with what those might look like too, but to increase the number of reported sales through livestock mandatory reporting. We already have about 50% cash trade in South Dakota, and then I know some other Northern Plains states are similar to us. So I think, but being able to incorporate additional reported sales, whether they're formula or grid or cash trade, would be beneficial to price discovery, would help make price discovery more robust and not just certain areas, but throughout the country. So, we're still trying to figure out what that might look like and how that might be achieved through those potential changes in livestock mandatory reporting. But I think anytime you can have more reported sales, that automatically helps with transparency.
Earlier, you touched on the fact that our other proteins, poultry and pork, they have become vertically integrated. Do you think the cattle industry is in danger of going down the same path?
Personally, I do not believe that. I think there are a lot more of us involved in, in the cow-calf sector at this point in time. I think that we have been not prone to inviting people into our businesses to explain to us how we could do it better, typically in our industry. We're very independent minded, and we want to make our own decisions and our own choices. And I think that's right. I think that's appropriate. We're the ones on the land. We should be making, the decisions that work best for our circumstances and our particular business models. I don't see a huge interest, even among the young producers that I know, moving toward that type of model.
Earlier, you also touched on how what we're doing as producers, how it affects the consumer in the long run. Do you feel that there's a chance that we could price ourselves out of a product, considering beef prices are at record highs in the grocery store?
I think that's an issue we have to always be cognizant of. Among the major, protein sectors, beef is already the most expensive if you go to purchase it, especially in a grocery store. And so we have to be really careful that we don't turn off consumers because they can't afford our product. And I know we haven't really talked about, we've talked about beef in comparison to chicken and pork or poultry and pork, but we haven't even touched on the other, what I term the fake meat products, or the alternative protein sources that are not a huge share of the market today, but certainly could potentially be a huge share of the market in another decade or two. And we need to keep our eye on that ball too, and recognize that, as I can only presume that as their production practices get more efficient in those products, their prices will tend to probably come down as well. And so we have to be really careful, I think, as an industry about making sure our product is still affordable, as well as, of course, by far the best protein available.
As you know, the Department of Justice is currently investigating our beef packers. What is your thoughts on that investigation?
I'm really anxiously awaiting the results of that investigation. We were hopeful that we would have the results of the investigation following the packing plant fire last fall, sometime this spring. I think it made some sense that USDA opted to just extend that investigation rather than close it out and start a new one once the pandemic struck. I think I'm glad to see that the Department of Justice has been looped in. I think it's really important that we have a robust investigation, and that we find out if there really were some illegal practices taking place. I hope that our industry, once the results of the investigation are made public or shared, that we can embrace whatever those results were and move forward in a constructive way. But I think I hope we'll see something come from that. Even if it's just we looked into it, we're confident nothing happened. I don't know if that'll be the case, but we need to have the results, hopefully sooner rather than later.
About a month ago, President Trump made the statement that he wanted to terminate trade deals where we import cattle into America. What is your thoughts on that statement, and your thoughts overall on trade deals concerning cattle and beef?
As the administration is sometimes prone to do these days, that was a little bit of a reckless statement to make. Our industry, we are definitely a net exporter of beef and beef products, both by value and by just sheer tonnage. If the numbers that I've been provided and have looked up are accurate, we export about $8 billion worth of beef and beef products, and we import only about $6 billion worth, which sounds like a lot, but I'll take that $2 billion, net gain. That extra $325 to $350 a head, I think, is really important to maintain. My concern is if we were to revisit any trade deals that allow for the importation of beef or cattle, then we have to be prepared for those trade partners to treat us similarly. And I think there's a lot more that we stand to lose in that scenario than that we would stand to gain in that scenario. We would be then forced ultimately just to stay even, right? Increase beef demand by $2 billion worth of beef. And I think that's domestic beef demand. And I think that would be a high hurdle to overcome. We really need to continue to explore ways to maximize the value of each animal and the carcass. And I think that's really difficult to do when we talk about just trying to do that domestically. When 97 or 98% of the population of the world lives outside of our borders, I think we need to maintain access to those potential consumers.
What are you hearing from some of your members, some of your South Dakota Cattlemen's members, as they do deal with these tough cattle markets?
We're like everybody else. We're hearing frustration. We know that this is not the first year of down cattle markets, and couple that with the fact that it's also not the first year of reduced commodity, other commodity markets like corn and soybeans and wheat and other crops that we raise here in South Dakota. So it's a challenge. There's no doubt about it. People are struggling. People are frustrated, and we get that. I feel fortunate, though, that my members are still, kind of standing by that we don't want any mandates, and we want to make sure that the solutions that we're offering are real solutions. And so we're kind of still being encouraged to stand firm in our policies that we've, held on to for a number of years. They're still, they're standing by the policies that our organization has put in place over the years through our membership meetings and whatnot. And they're saying, let's look for solutions, but let's do it in a really thoughtful, sort of step-by-step manner.
If for some reason we don't get some kind of changes implemented within our cattle markets, or if things don't turn around in the near future and these tough cattle markets go on for, let's say, 2-3 more years, what do you see happening to the American cattle producer?
I think we're going to have some really challenging times with or without challenging markets in the cattle industry in the next few years. I say that partly because I see a lot of, our average age of the cattle producers, especially in the Northern Plains, continues to creep upwards. I think we've got a lot of actual real estate that's going to have to see some change in ownership over the next probably decade or so. I think it's going to be challenging. We're definitely a capital intensive industry, especially if you're involved primarily in livestock production. There's a lot of high hurdles for livestock producers to overcome, especially young people trying to get into the industry or trying to stay in the industry if they're just getting started. We need a better, I think, mentoring program or way to match up some of those folks that are nearing retirement with some of the younger producers and help with that. I haven't been able to really wrap my arms around what that should look like either, other than I just talk about it once in a while. We're going to continue to be challenged, especially as if we resist the vertical integration model that some of the other proteins have passed. There's just a lot to overcome. I think you have to really be an eternal optimist to be a livestock producer. And not only an eternal optimist, but an eternal, maybe a workaholic is a good word for it, especially in the Northern Plains. We don't get to cook 2 or 3 months off in the winter time and things like maybe some other folks do. And so we're going to be challenged either way. Higher cattle prices make those challenges fewer, but they certainly don't go away. Lower cattle prices make those challenges greater, but they don't take away any of the other challenges, the weather challenges and just the access to capital challenges and things like that we have either. I think our organization has expressed interest in the past, and we continue to sort of explore conversations with partner organizations about how do we create better risk management tools? What does that look like? Maybe so not necessarily that will help us in the short term get through this pandemic and these challenges, but how do we avoid getting in this position again in the future? Whether that's a crop insurance type of program or, we're sure interested in trying to see how we can make the futures markets work better as a risk management tool. So sort of exploring things on all of those fronts to try to provide more certainty in that regard.
So you mentioned the CME Futures Market. It's straightened out now, but a couple months ago it was all over the place, limit up, limit down. Do you feel that is still an adequate risk management tool?
No. Our members have been pretty clear that is a challenge that we have to figure out how to overcome. And certainly, we are, as a National Cattlemen's Beef Association affiliate, we have a representative serving on their current working group right now, and they're looking at all kinds of issues, including, the futures markets. We've talked about it over and over just among our membership, the idea that, there's a lot of speculation going on in those markets right now versus maybe how they were decades ago. We're trying to figure out some solutions for how that can be addressed. I know there's a lot of frustration out there with the uncertainty related to that, what was once a risk management tool.
If you could sum it up into one sentence, what does the cattle industry need most today?
I think we really, really need to maintain and build beef demand. We're ultimately going to have to eat our way out of this backlog of cattle that, we're backed up because of packing plant closures and slowdowns and whatnot. And we really need to do everything in our power to move that beef so we can keep moving these cattle.
How do we do that? How do we move more beef? How do we keep our demand strong? Because obviously consumers are facing sticker shock and they are facing incredibly tough economic times. I mean, the unemployment rate is record high, close to record high. So how do we maintain that demand, if not increase it a little bit? How do you think we do that?
That is a really good question, Mackenzie, and I'm certainly one I do not claim to be an expert on. I think that's for, the checkoff folks are better at at answering probably those questions than I am. As producers, we need to continue to reassure them that the beef that they're getting is good and safe, and above all, the best protein source for the dollar that they can buy. And we just need to do everything we can to not call that into question.